My name is Kristen. I'm filling in for Sarah with the clerk's office. And tonight, your community academy topic is the Housing Commission. And here with us is Jennifer Hall, who will be able to tell you more about it. I'm going to turn my camera off and continue moving people in as they arrive, and then I'll also help out with questions, Jennifer, if you want, or you can feel free to kind of deal with or like manage the questions as they come in.
Okay, I will try to keep an eye on it, but I might need your help because I sometimes forget to look at that section. For those who are joining as panelists, feel free to pop a question while I'm talking or when you hear a pause, and I'll try to pause every so often to see if there are questions because I know my presentation is very dense. I'll start out by introducing myself. My name is Jennifer Hall. I am the director of the Ann Arbor Housing Commission. We are a public body corporate, so we're a governmental entity. We were created by the city of Ann Arbor, and we are actually one of the few housing commissions in the United States that are city employees. Typically, we are separate entities from our municipality that created us. What I like to do is start off with some questions, and I am going to share my screen. And hopefully you all can see this. My first question for you all is well, I usually have people introduce themselves, but this is when we're in person. But think of something that you would like to learn today and feel free to shout it out. And I just want to write down if there's something I don't think I'm going to cover to make sure I cover it today is what you'd like to learn about affordable housing. Either send it as a message or you can just go ahead and start. David or Hannah or Bill?
Yeah, my name is Hannah, and I'm really interested to learn about future plans for expanding the affordable housing that is accessible in Ann Arbor.
Okay, accessible as in like for people with disabilities?
Just generally, whether it's for people with disabilities, just more and more, like just adding affordable housing in general,
Gotcha.
yeah, like what's the time horizon on that?
Okay, I will definitely be covering that. Hardest part of making housing affordable, I will be covering that and the SEU. I'll see what I can say about that.
Uh, my name is David Stone. I guess I have some interest in. I know we have a huge, overwhelming demand for affordable housing, right? And then I know you use some sort of criteria to kind of prioritize access, and I'm just curious if what the methodology looks like, and anything you could share or insights from like what that process looks like. I know I could probably look online and look at the criteria for specific projects and things, but I'm just curious, like, what are some of the challenges associated with that, and um, are there things that you would change about that process if you could?
Okay, got it. Okay, if I could ignore money, how many affordable housing units would we have? I can answer that question. All right. Thank you, everyone, and feel free to add more as we go. Hold on, gotta figure out how to use my mouse here. And I'm gonna move these questions off to the side. Okay, so first thing to talk about is what is affordable housing? The generally accepted definition, which has only come into play since the 1960s, 1970s, is that if you spend less than 30% of your gross household income, your annual income, on your housing costs, then you are living in affordable housing. Otherwise, you are what's considered cost burdened. And it doesn't matter what your income is. It doesn't matter if you make $10,000 or $100,000 or $1,000,000. The definition doesn't change. It doesn't matter if you're in a rental property or a homeowner property. It would include your, your mortgage, taxes, utilities, etc. If you were in ownership or if you're in a co-op, there is a sort of momentum gathering around defining affordable housing as both your housing cost and your transportation cost. So if it exceeds 45% of your income, you're considered cost burden. And so if you think about Ann Arbor is a very good example. If you can't afford to live in Ann Arbor, and so you're moving, and maybe you live in Ann Arbor, so you're moving farther and farther away to get to your place of employment. And so you may have lower housing costs, but you have higher transportation costs. Or if you're in an urban area with a lot of good public transportation, you could live near your transit area and you may have lower transportation costs. I do want to say that there is a lot of discussion out there that you may hear some terms like workforce housing or missing middle housing or public housing. I personally just say affordable housing because it covers all kinds of broad spectrum of folks who need housing, which is all of us. So I don't really see any difference between, for example, workforce housing and affordable housing. All the housing that we provide, the majority of our residents have jobs, unless they are a senior citizen or they're have just on disability income. So they're all in the workforce. And I also want to let folks know that when I talk about affordable housing, and I sometimes forget to mention this, there is affordable housing that's specifically subsidized housing for seniors, and it generally doesn't have an income requirement. It just has an age requirement. Usually it's either 55 years and older or 62 years and older. What is the Housing Commission? What do we do? We own and manage 19 properties currently, all in the city of Ann Arbor. We're not restricted to only owning housing in the city of Ann Arbor. That's where we started, that's where we were created, and that's where we have operations right now. We are one of the largest providers of affordable housing when you include all of our programs, which includes our voucher program. Many people have heard of the Section 8 program. It's now called the Housing Choice Voucher, and that's just a new marketing term, just like people don't like to think about public housing anymore. It has a lot of negative associations with it. The voucher program for us covers all of Washtenaw County as well as all of Monroe County, and we have just a few households who live in Western Wayne County, because we used to cover Western Wayne County, but we don't anymore. So they're just grandfathered in. We have a couple special programs that we do as a housing commission. Not every housing commission chooses to do that. We have a family self-sufficiency program where the goal is for people to have economic independence and no longer have a need for government subsidized housing. And the other program is a homeownership program where you can actually take your voucher and instead of paying for rent to a private landlord, you can actually use it to pay for a mortgage and insurance for a home that you own. Don't have a lot of homeowners. It's very hard to do in our county because, as you all know, it's very expensive. So it's hard to get a mortgage, and it's hard to find a bank that will take a voucher as a form of payment. It's just an unusual thing. On our housing side that we own and manage, this is the breakdown of the number of units, or units and by bedroom size. We generally really don't build studio apartments, efficiency apartments anymore. That happens to be Lurie Terrace that we acquired about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was built with studio apartments. We really don't build that anymore. We do 1 bedrooms or more, and it's rare for housing commissions or any private landlords really To have 4 and 5 bedroom apartments, it would tend to be a house if you had that big of a unit. And so we're kind of unusual in that we have 4 and 5 bedroom apartments as well. We do have income restrictions, anywhere from 30% of median income to 80%. I'm going to show a chart later on to see what those income restrictions, what those AMI mean in real dollars. The vast majority of our tenants pay 30% of their income on rent, and then HUD subsidizes the rest. The biggest exception is Lurie Terrace, which is a senior property that when we purchased it, has 136 apartments. It's on here on, they didn't have any rent subsidies at all. So we've gradually been adding rent subsidies for qualified households there. This is a map showing sort of the distribution by ward, by council ward in the city of Ann Arbor of where our properties are located. You can see there's some parts of the city, southeast side, the far west side, middle west side, that have more housing that we own than other parts of the city. We are not the only affordable housing provider. The other bigger providers would be Avalon Housing, that does really pretty exclusively permanent supportive housing for homeless households. About 30, I just looked it up the other day, I want to say it was 38% of our households were homeless at the time that they moved into our housing, whereas Avalon is really probably 90+%. There's the cooperatives that have income and restrictions and the amount that you pay for your membership. So they're considered in the affordable housing realm. There's a variety of senior housing and Parkway Meadows, I think it's called, up in the northeast side of Ann Arbor, is one of the largest affordable housing properties in the city of Ann Arbor. They have something like 400-ish apartments up there, owned by privately owned apartments. The vast majority of affordable housing that is built in the United States right now is actually owned by for-profit private companies. It's not actually built and owned by housing commissions as much anymore, and it's not as many that are owned and built by nonprofits. And I'll talk about that a little bit later, why that is. I'm going to talk about the wait list in this section that somebody asked about. In the voucher program, what we have is mainly I'll just call them our regular vouchers, but we also have a lot of specialty type vouchers. So we have vouchers for people who are non-elderly disabled. So you have to be over 18, less than 62 years old, and have someone in your household who has a disability. Family unification vouchers is for households that families have lost their children or in danger of losing their children. And the thing that's a barrier to them is having stable housing to get their children back into their family. We have emergency vouchers. We have a new voucher program, foster youth initiative. We have veterans, homeless veterans vouchers, all kinds of vouchers. So the map to the left, it's just the Washtenaw County. The vast majority of our vouchers in Washtenaw County. This shows the distribution of where vouchers are utilized within all of our programs. And you can see it's a clear concentration in the urban areas of the county. But you will also see in this next map, it's kind of very similar. This is just our tenant-based vouchers. We have a thing called project-based vouchers. About 800 of those vouchers are project-based and the rest are tenant-based. So what is the difference? A tenant-based voucher is attached to the tenant, is attached to the person who has the voucher, and they can take it anywhere in the county or in Monroe County that fits within their voucher dollar amount that the landlord accepts vouchers, although that has just recently changed at the state level where you can't specifically deny someone housing because they have a voucher. That just got passed in the last couple months. So it's statewide, that is no longer allowed, but that does not mean that landlords find other ways to discriminate against folks who are low income or have a voucher. You can put all kinds of barriers in place, like requiring a certain credit score or looking at making sure your income is, a certain minimum amount of income in order to move in, things like that. And so when you look at our tenant-based vouchers, theoretically, the idea is you have a choice. It's a housing choice voucher. The idea is you can move wherever you want to, but it still means that you are limited to where there is housing available, and there is a cap on the value of a voucher. And what ends up happening is a majority of our vouchers end up being used on the far eastern part of the county in Ypsi City and Ypsi Township, because that is where there is lower cost housing, and that is where the vouchers can be used. How do we figure out who can get a voucher? How do people get into our housing? Anything that has HUD funding is required to have a HUD regulated waitlist. And when I say HUD regulated, there's all kinds of regulations tied to it that we have to follow. And if HUD were ever to come audit us or pull our files, they have to make sure that we're following them. Income being one, the income limit is 50% of the area median income, and that's for your whole household and includes anybody over 18. There's certain things that are excluded. There's ways to calculate your assets, things like that. But that's the main criteria. We have adopted voluntarily, and we have it in what's called our administrative plan. HUD allows certain preferences, and the preferences that we've adopted are living or working in our catchment area, so to speak, which is Washtenaw and Monroe County, so that if you live or work there, that you have a preference over other people. If you have a person in your household with a disability, then we have a preference for that. We have a preference for, I know I'm missing one, I can't think of what it is. Sorry, I'm blanking. And then we have what's called a limited preference for homeless households. And the reason it's a limited preference is that we have a requirement that the person be referred through Housing Access of Washtenaw County, which is our centralized intake and assessment process that we have. And they have to have services with them, whether it's through us or through another agency we contract with, or through another agency we don't contract with. Maybe they're working with CMH. And so those are our preferences. Again, I feel like I'm missing one. It might be elderly. And so we end up opening our wait list also through a regulated process. We have to let the public know when our wait list is open. The last time we opened it was in 2020, and we had over 4,000 people apply for our voucher wait list, our tenant-based voucher wait list, and we had over 3,000 people, families, households apply for our project-based voucher wait list. When we did not have preferences, when we had anybody could apply anywhere in the United States, when we opened up our wait list, I think it was in 2015 or somewhere thereabouts, I can't remember, we had over 15,000 applicants. So I think the biggest difference with what happened when we added preferences is we didn't end up with a bunch of people from California, Oregon, Texas, wherever the case may be, apply to our wait list. Because when you think about it, it is a federal program. And so you can apply for any federally HUD-funded programs anywhere in the United States. And you can actually, if you get into housing here or get a voucher here, you can port it, it's what it's called, to another housing commission in another state if you want to move. And that's all allowed by HUD. I think it was David. David, are you the one that asked me about how we prioritize access to our housing? Is there anything I missed on that?
No, that was helpful. Thank
you. I just saw my notes that you asked about the challenges. One of the biggest challenges is you open up your wait list in 2020 and you may not get pulled till 2025 or 2026. And we may not be able to find you if you haven't been updating us and letting us know that you've moved, if you've switched phones, if you switched addresses. We end up pulling about 100 households at a time for every 10 openings that we have, because it is very challenging when things get that old to find people. And that is very painful because we get thousands of people contacting us every year that are currently right now desperately in need of housing, are in a housing crisis, and we cannot accept them into our housing unless they go through our waitlist process or unless they go through the Hawk process. And so there's a big mismatch between people who are in need right now and when housing is available. And really, that can only be solved by having many, many more vouchers and many more affordable housing units available to people so that we can house people when they need the housing. That is probably the biggest challenge. We do have a couple wait lists that are not HUD regulated. So again, Lurie Terrace is senior housing. We do have to have 62 and older households move in, but it's not income based. So we have a separate wait list for that. And we are about to open up housing at, I'm going to talk about it later on, but a place on Catherine and 4th called Dunbar Tower. Half the units are for homeless households and half are for low income households that are in the arts or creative fields or, hobbyists. And that will have its own separate wait list when at the point in time when we're ready to fill those units. And it is a new thing for us, and it's not a HUD regulated wait list. It will have a whole separate wait list process. I'm going to pause right there and see if there is any questions at this point about our programs. And then I'll continue on after that.
I have follow-up questions, but I don't want to take too much time. But I'll ask one quick follow-up in terms of
Yeah, go ahead.
like obviously long wait lists, et cetera. But there probably are folks who are in an emergency situation, maybe a family with kids. They're about to become homeless, or what kind of programs exist to kind of handle those kind of time sensitive things? Obviously, everybody needs housing, but I'm just curious how that is integrated into your workflow because not everybody knows how to navigate the systems and things.
Yes. I actually have a slide with a couple slides about that, and I will cover that, David, when we get there.
Thank you.
Yep, no problem. And then somebody asked who funds the voucher programs? Federal. There are some funds that come through the state, but they all start out at the federal level. Somebody asked if you could ignore money, how many affordable housing units would you have for Ann Arbor? I say this all the time when people ask me, 10,000. I would have 10,000 affordable housing units. And the city currently has, I don't know, remember the exact amount, 50-ish thousand units of housing, owner, rental, co-op, the mix. I would do 20 to 25% of them as affordable for people who are low income. We work with a lot of community partners, and that was part of my discussion later, David. We actually have contracts with 6 different agencies to directly provide services at 100% of the properties we own. The services are free, the services are voluntary, and they are available. Most of them are, we have a community center in the building, but if we don't have a community center, then people can come to a community center to meet with their service provider. And we also have partnerships with a lot of agencies that we don't directly contract with, like Food Gatherers that provides food, both hot meals, food banks, etc., at almost every one of our sites. University of Michigan School of Pharmacy has students that come in. They work with Packard Health Clinic, and they have a nurse practitioner and a doctor who come into some of our sites and review medications for folks to make sure there's not some problems with the medications they're taking and things like that. So lots of different relationships in the community, including SOS, who is our main provider for our tenant-based vouchers. Whenever somebody's in danger of either losing their voucher or getting evicted, then they will work with them to make sure they stay housed. All right, so here's one of my questions, and this you can think about in your own head. So how do you think low-income residents are impacted by the city of Ann Arbor's housing market? And this is where I start going into the definition of area median income, and I'll talk about the housing market and how to develop housing. So what happens every year is HUD looks at I think it's called the American Community Survey. It's related to the census, and they look at every community, in the United States, and they determine what the area median income is. This one is the median family income, and this year is 125,900. Last year was 119,600. That is a huge jump. Historically, I've seen it go up from as little as $400 or $500 a year to typically like 1,000, going up by $6,000. That's a huge jump from 24 to 25. When you compare Ann Arbor to the rest of the United States, the median income is 104,200 for the rest of the United States. And when you look at this chart, what HUD does is it takes the median income and they just stick it in this chart as a 4-person household. Every other number in this chart is a formula. It's a formula. It doesn't mean that they calculated 1-person households. They didn't calculate 2. They didn't calculate 3 separate from a 4. It's just the whole entire community, the median income, and then the rest of it is distributed by formula. And the reason that the 60% AMI line is bolded is that is the main income target for a variety of City of Ann Arbor housing programs, not necessarily just the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, but through our planning and zoning, our brownfield policies, that if we have housing that is provided that is lower than market rate, that target is to be at the 60% of median income or less. And so when you look at, for example, a 1-person household at 30% of median income, that $26,460 is more than if you were making minimum wage, working full time, you would make less than that 26,460. You would be in that 30% of area median income. Now, if you were in a different community, like I grew up in Kalamazoo, the median income is significantly less than Ann Arbor, and so their 30% of AMI will be less than our 30% AMI. It's very specific to the community that you're in. And this actually, even though it says Ann Arbor's median income, it is all of Washtenaw County. Ann Arbor is the primary metropolitan statistical area and includes all of Washtenaw County. So I'm going to ask you to all imagine in your mind, if you're thinking about a price point of what someone pays for their monthly housing cost, what do you think that price point would be that you think we need more of in our community? Like, is it less than $1,000? Is it less than $1,500? Is it less than $800? Whatever the case may be. Like, picture that in your mind when you think about what we need as affordable housing here. Because what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this chart and I'm going to convert it to what you would pay as 30% of your household income. So a 4-person household at median income would be paying $3,147,000 or less for it to be considered affordable. And so think about where you landed in this chart in the dollar amount of what you think we need more of in the community. Because most of the time people are surprised at how high this is, for example, of what we're trying to target or, below. So 60% AMI below, or these rents are below, generally speaking. And how do you compare that when you think about programs that are based on the federal poverty level? Here's the 2025 poverty level based on household size. So you can see that those are where they're talking about 15% AMI, 20% AMI compared to Ann Arbor. And when you look at our housing market, this represents a chart that was all of Washtenaw County. The county put this chart together. It shows all households, whether it's those that have a mortgage, those that are rental, those that are occupied, those that are vacant, and those that are, quote, affordable. And when you look at this chart, this represents, hold on, I have it written down, but I gotta find it. Un momento. Just under 160,000 total units. And I apologize for saying the word units. It's just a generic bureaucratic speak for any kind of housing. So there's 160, just under 160,000 units, and of those, the number that are affordable is that little bitty yellow line at the bottom that's crossing through the blue line. And those are any units that have some kind of income restriction, not what's called naturally occurring affordable, but just has some kind of restriction because there's some kind of subsidy or something that requires them to be for a specific income level. And the blue, the light blue that it is crossing through is literally the number of vacant units at any given time when they do this count. And so there's literally more vacant units than there are units that are specifically set aside for low-income households in our county. One thing you'll hear sometimes with folks that work in this area is you'll hear something called fair market rents. And this again is something that is based on the American Community Survey, and it looks at every community, and it looks at all housing in that community that is built in the last 2 years. Sorry, all the rental housing is built and it does not include that anything that's been built in the last 2 years, and it does not include subsidized housing. So they're trying to get an understanding of what's happening in your marketplace, and so they call this the fair market rent. And this chart is really just to illustrate to you what's been happening in the marketplace. Clearly, prices going up. There's a little blip in 2008, 2009 with worldwide economic changes that were happening. But look at what's happening recently, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25. There's a huge increase compared to historically just in the last few years. I like to show this map because it is really important to understand the history and the decisions that were made in the 1960s related to forming the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, as well as other developing of other affordable housing. If you can picture, this is really focused in on the urban areas of the city of Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti. So in 1960, prior to any fair housing or civil rights laws being passed, there were limited areas where people could move if they were people of color. When they were coming from the south, moving up north during the Great Migration in Ann Arbor, the greatest concentration of where people could live is where that orange, where you can see this orange sort of dot, and that is considered the what the Black community calls the West Side. It is generally in the 5th Ward, and the reason that that was a place where people were limited to where they could live is it was actually a very industrialized area. It was where there was a lot more sort of dirty slaughterhouses. It was where the grain and coal was stored. It was where the junkyards were, and so it was not is not what it looks like today in that area, which is basically it's kind of surrounding or Summit, Miller, and Division, and all the way up to sort of past Main Street. So they're both on the west side and over the river around Depot Town. That is where that box is covering that area. And within that area, where Community High School is right now, that used to be known as Jones School. That was the Jones Elementary School, and that was where the vast majority of Black kids were able to go to school. and that was where the Dunbar Community Center was located, was on 4th Avenue, right in that community. There was a vibrant Black business district that was on Ann Street and 4th Avenue. And that was like the very central part of the Black social and civic life. And then you'll see when you look over in Ypsilanti, there's the south side of Ypsi, which even a higher concentration of Black households back in 1960, as well as the big orange square, which is around Willow Run Airport. And so if you move forward a few years to today, or 2020, there's a change in where people live. There's a change in where people of different races live, particularly in the Black community. There's no longer that concentration of households or that intact neighborhood on the west side that there used to be. And in fact, there's been a big shift in where Black households live, both more dispersed, but also more concentrated on the east side of the county over in Ypsilanti and Ypsi Township. There was a 2015 report called the Martin Prosperity Institute's Segregated City Report. And what they found was that Washtenaw County, excuse me, was the 8th most segregated, economically segregated county in the United States. And that is very much reflected in this map. Not that economic and race are exactly tied hand in hand, but it is a indicator as well. I would like to acknowledge Cameron Donald is here, who we did a partnership with. We produced a film with Cameron, who created, some of you may have seen or heard of, A Letter to the West Side, which was, excuse me, a film that he directed. He interviewed people who grew up and lived in the west side of Ann Arbor, and talked about what it was like growing up in the segregated neighborhood, and the how the families there supported each other, how the businesses there thrive, but also how that neighborhood has changed and is no longer a cohesive Black neighborhood, and is very much a gentrified neighborhood. So when I look at what's actually happening in our community, when I think about where is poverty concentrated, I actually don't like the idea of using poverty as an indicator or where poor people live. And so if you look at this map, anybody who is on the panel, is there anything about this map that sticks out to you as far as where the purple areas are in the county?
I noticed that a lot of it is around the University of Michigan campus, which I think makes sense because a lot of university students either have very little to no income, but they often come from pretty affluent families, so I wouldn't necessarily call them poor.
That is exactly correct. And so when people say to me, where we have our housing that we own, that we have a concentration of poverty, I'm like, you have not actually lived or been through and into a poor community, because that is not described Ann Arbor, any community in Ann Arbor, any neighborhood in Ann Arbor. And when you look at poverty, it's based on what people report to the census. And that is, your choice. You can say, I live in Ann Arbor, I'm a student, or you can say, I live in Kalamazoo with my parents. And so when you look at poverty by age, this shows you exactly what's happening in Ann Arbor, and it's similar, but not exclusively like this in Ypsi, but in and around EMU and Washtenaw Community College. But there is definitely a much higher concentration of poverty on the east side of the county. And this is a map. What I like to use is people who are on public assistance as more of an indicator of where low income, poor people, poor households live. It is not in the city of Ann Arbor. It is on the eastern side of the county. So when somebody asked how many affordable housing units I would have in Ann Arbor, we need a lot. we need to have our fair share of providing opportunity for people to access, the jobs that are here, the public transit is here, the parks, the schools, etc. We do not have very many low-income households actually living in Ann Arbor. All right, I'm getting to your question, David, about what happens so what's the impact? Because the housing costs are so high, because there's not enough affordable housing, we have a high number of homeless households. This is what an indicator of the housing access of Washtenaw County. What that is, it's run by the Office of Community and Economic Development, and they take phone calls from people who are in a housing crisis, whether they are homeless, whether they are worried about becoming homeless. This is just a month, July of 2024, of how many phone calls they have. It doesn't mean they get one call once. They can get multiple calls. And what those of us who provide housing, low-income housing, and those of us who provide services and sheltering, we've all agreed that we will utilize this central intake and assessment process. So it used to be that if you were in a housing crisis, you would call every shelter and every housing provider to try to figure out how to get into something. Now you go through a central intake process, and what happens is you get assessed on the family side by SOS, you get assessed by the Shelter Association on the single adult side. There's a sort of a separate track for veterans and youth, and you have an assessment done to see what your situation is, and they try to figure out how to best address your needs. Sometimes folks can, they can get diverted from losing their housing by sometimes folks have a emergency that is short-term and acute. Whether that's you get in a car accident, you lose your car, then you lose your job, you have a medical situation, but it is short-term and can be solved with some community resources. Sometimes people need long-term, what's called permanent supportive housing. Sometimes on the family side, people can get sort of moderate term assistance, have some rental subsidy for 6 months to a year until their housing situation is stabilized, their economic situation is stabilized, and then their family becomes stabilized. Sometimes people need intensive services, sometimes people don't need much services at all. I will not lie and say that every household gets what they need, because most households need long-term, low-cost housing, and we do not have enough, period, the end. And so that does impact our homeless population. And the population that is growing the most are families with children. And the population that's the most stable is veterans. And the reason that veterans are the most stable and have the lowest incidence, but also the shortest period of time that they stay homeless, is because there is a nationwide push to put resources toward veterans, and there has been for at least a decade, with both the VA and vouchers and more wraparound intensive services. And so that is a model that has showed that with enough resources, you actually can address and limit the amount of time somebody spends while they're when they do become homeless through whatever emergency happened that led them to that place. The biggest struggle we have right now is with families with children. There just is not enough rental subsidy and housing in our community to address that population. I'm going to pause right there, see if there's any questions or comments. I will say, somebody asked about the hardest part of affordable housing, but that was my only note, hardest affordable, and I don't remember the rest of the question, but the hardest for me and many people do the work that we do is dealing with families with children. It is so traumatic for kids. It is so hard for families. And it is very challenging when you are in a destabilized housing situation, mentally, physically, emotionally. You don't have the stability of even schools all the time because you may be moving from one school district to another. And so that is really the biggest crisis that I see and the hardest for us to address. I'm going to slightly shift gears from homelessness, and I am going to ask you to think about when you think about Ann Arbor or even Washtenaw County, what in your mind, you can think of this to yourself, what is our biggest industry? And when you think about a place like you think about Pittsburgh, they're known for their historically for steel and now for like insurance or something like that. Like, what is our biggest industry? Well, our biggest industry is higher education and the health systems, both Michigan Medicine and Trinity Health. By far, the biggest employer is the University of Michigan among all across Washtenaw County. And that has a huge impact on our marketplace, both with the student population, which is what most people think about, is how students impact our marketplace. But along with students comes jobs and economic growth of the university and people who are working here and people who want to live here. And so over time, the university for the city of Ann Arbor has had the biggest impact by far on our housing market. And until recently, the university hasn't really provided new dorms for their students beyond what was built. I don't know when all those dorms were built back in the day, Mary Markley, Jordan Hall, but recently U of M has building over by Elbow Field. When you drive by there, you'll see there's thousands of new dorms going in, and they're redeveloping their North Campus, their family housing that's out on North Campus. And I'm hearing that they're going to be developing more than what was there previously, more density, which is all good. Their perspective is that it's an advantage to the community for them not to provide housing for their students because none of the housing they provide is taxable, which is true. And so if the private sector is providing housing, then it's providing a taxable income to the city that provides police, fire, road, etc. It's a challenge, the whole relationship between the city, county, and the university, given how much land is taken off the tax rolls by all of our entities that are public entities, and particularly the University of Michigan. When you look at our population increases, it pretty much mirrors the increase in population of the student population. And if somebody who is working in Ann Arbor, but is not able to live here, there's a huge impact on our roads and on the transportation system. So this is from 2019. There's over 90,000 people. This is pre-COVID. It's changed a little bit, but not tremendously since then. Over 90,000 people who work in the city of Ann Arbor but do not live here come into work. 24,000 who live and work here, and 21,000 that live here but work somewhere else. And so when people observe what's going on in the community, and I hear this a lot, I know city council does as well, about complaints about expensive high-rise housing for students. and the amount of traffic that's happening in the community. And those are a byproduct of what's happening in our marketplace. There's a demand for student housing, and that's why developers are building it. And even though somebody on paper may look like they're in poverty on their census, when they report to the census, it doesn't mean that their family isn't helping to pay for their housing. And so when people can't live in the city, then you see a lot of traffic coming in and out of the city. This is just an illustration of the amount of property that is off the tax rolls, not just by the university, by public schools, by the city, by the county, etc. We did a housing needs assessment in, I think it was 2020, and we really just looked at the area in the downtown that was on not part of the campus, so anything west of State Street. And what our consultant found was that we needed about 13 to 1400 new units for people who are under 30% AMI, under 1,000 for 31 to 60% AMI, and 370 to 490 for 61 to 100% AMI. That's just what that was, just looking at our downtown. So when I talk about 10,000, I'm talking about the entire city boundaries. So there's such a huge demand for affordable housing. Why isn't the private sector building it? I can tell you from experience, because I'm going to talk about this in a minute, you cannot build affordable housing for households, I'm going to say in Ann Arbor, under 80% of median income, and definitely not under 60% of median income, without public subsidy. What is public subsidy? It could be free or low cost land. It can be low cost loans. It can be grants. It can be fee reductions. It can be tax reductions. It can be all kinds of things. It can be increased density, but the private sector cannot build it with the cost of land, what it is, as well as the cost of materials and the cost of labor to build housing right now. The math absolutely does not work. I'm going to talk about how development happens and how subsidies happen. And I'm going to ask this question, and I'm going to see if anybody is willing to, whatever you're thinking about is the biggest federal housing subsidy program, if anybody has an idea of what it might be. Any guesses on, oh yeah, go ahead, Bill.
The tax deduction you get for your interest that you pay on your home?
You are 100% correct. Most people think it would be some kind of rental program like the voucher program. It is not. For those of us who own our own homes, which I do, the mortgage interest deduction and tax deduction on our personal taxes is more than the HUD budget, more than the HUD budget. And most people are surprised to learn that. So we actually subsidize homeowners more than we subsidize renters. If you look at HUD's budget, HUD is no longer actually the biggest source of subsidy for affordable housing. There was a big jump during COVID from 53 billion up to 90 billion. It's gone down, but actually this last year it was 72.6 billion for 2025. That was based on the continuing resolution that was adopted. I have no prediction for what is going to happen in 2026, if that is somebody's question. I was pleasantly surprised that the voucher program that we receive funding from, not only was it, the funding was not only was it held steady from 2024, there was actually a slight increase. My best prediction as to why that happened is because the vast majority of voucher funding actually goes to private landlords. So the private sector, the most of our voucher funding that we have, the rent subsidy we pays, goes to McKinley because McKinley is the biggest private landlord in our county. But there's a lot of other private landlords. So that's my best guess to why that was a sort of protected this year, but I don't know if that will continue. I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm going to pause for a second before I talk about housing development because it's a little dense. Is there anybody who has a question or comment about anything that's been talked about so far?
To your point about the university building additional housing, is that anticipated that that's going to relieve pressure on the rental market and potentially lower rental rates or rent prices for folks who would otherwise be, priced out of the area? I'm just curious if there's any
Yeah,
data.
I anticipate it will impact positively the marketplace. The thing that is unpredictable, and only the university knows, is if the university keeps increasing its student population while it also is increasing its housing, then it's also increasing its staff, and so then it really minimize the positive impact, but it might keep it more stable. It's like if everything stayed the same and all they did was add 6,000 units of housing for their students, it would definitely impact the marketplace. Somebody asked about how does the city partner with townships? Sadly, we live in a home rule state. What does that mean? Most states have what would essentially be like the county and then a city. In Michigan and a few other states, we have cities, villages, townships, and counties. And surrounding the city of Ann Arbor, we have what most of them are charter townships. And so they have a lot of the same rights as a legal entity that a city has related to its boundaries. And so in other states, you could continue to expand your water sewer, add more housing. You don't have to annex somebody else, some other municipality's property, whereas in Michigan, you have to do that. So we are very limited and there's not nearly enough collaboration across municipal boundaries that would be helpful. Okay, I'm going to talk about how do you develop affordable housing. This is showing what it costs, just an example of what it costs to develop a market rate housing development, let's say with 100 units versus a affordable housing 100 unit building. When I said that HUD is not the biggest provider of subsidy for affordable housing, what has happened over time is the transition from public housing, which was actually created not for low income households, but for working households back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And over time, it has changed from being housing for the working class to housing that is for low income households. And over time, it's been completely disinvested at the federal level. When I first started working at the Housing Commission and I went around and looked at all of our properties, I was like, oh my gosh, we are the biggest slumlord in the city. I was horrified by the condition of our properties. And then when I looked at our finances, I was like, okay, I get it, because there is not enough rent coming in to cover the cost of maintaining these buildings. And so in 2013, HUD recognized that and they said, there's not enough money anymore on the public housing side. Congress seems to like the voucher program, which was created after public housing to try to have a public-private partnership, and it's better funded. So HUD said any housing commission that wants to change their rent subsidy from public housing to voucher, project-based voucher, you can apply. So we applied. We're one of 10 housing commissions that were approved for our entire portfolio to convert under what's called the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program, RAD. So we just finished that between 2014 and 2020. We converted all of our public housing to project-based vouchers, and HUD did not give us any money for the redevelopment of those sites. I had to go raise that money myself. And the biggest source right now is called low-income housing tax credits. It is not a HUD program. It is a IRS program. And the way it works is Congress allocates a certain amount of tax credits to every state. There's a formula. The state of Michigan administers it for the state of Michigan. They hold a competition, and you can compete for these tax credits. We were awarded tax credits for most of our developments, and we do not pay taxes as an organization. So what do? We have to sell them. So you sell them to an investor, and the investor buys them from you for cash, and you use that cash to help redevelop your sites, and then the investor writes them off on their tax returns, on their business tax returns. So when I talk about low-income housing tax credits, which I will for the next couple slides, that is what I am talking about. So the costs are roughly the same. There's not a heck of a lot of difference between what it costs. I have to pay an architect, so does somebody else, so does market rate. I've got to buy land, they got to buy land, I got to pay for materials. That's not where the big difference is. The biggest difference between developing affordable and market rate is how it is financed. So on the market rate side, this is just typical, there's all kinds of ways to do it, but typically you would take out, just like when you buy a house for yourself, you would put money down, you'd have equity into the house, you put money down, let's say 20%, and then you take out a loan for 80% of the financing. It's very similar in market rate developments. The majority of the funds come from loans, and then they look for equity investors. On the affordable side, it is swapped. The equity from the low-income housing tax credits in the blue, in the middle, is going to be more than a loan that you take out. As costs have increased over time, since COVID happened, that's the orange is getting bigger and the blue is getting smaller, but typically that is the reverse of each other. Now, the lower the income target that you are targeting, so if you have a lot of 30% AMI households, then you cannot take on as much debt, because how do you pay your debt? You pay it with rent. And if your tenants have a lower income, then you have to have lower rent. And so you end up having to go out and get a bunch of grants, and that's what's in gray. And what does that look like on the operating side? On the operating side, a large amount of what the private sector's rent payments go toward is paying their debt. So the debt is in orange. They have operating costs, maintenance, property management. The yellow is taxes, and then they have, their return on their investment and their cash flow in blue. What is different about that between the market rate side and then the 60% AMI tax credit versus having lower income target on your tax credit side? You have a little bit higher operating costs because maintenance tends to be higher. You have a lot more regulations you have to comply with on the property management side. Your debt's going to be smaller, and you only have to maintain like a 1.15 debt coverage service ratio on your loan, which is represented in that dark blue. And so the operating costs can be smaller on the affordable side because you don't have as much debt. And so when people wonder why we have expensive high rises, that's because it is market rate. It's driven by the market, It's what the market can pay, but it's also what the developer can afford if they don't have a lot of subsidy. This is a chart when we redeveloped all of our properties under the RAD program. This is the source of funding that we use. These are the actual sources of funding. You can see we had a tiny little baby HUD grant that was a special grant that we applied for, but the rest came from primarily low-income housing tax credits, debt, and then local city funds. So the city does have a goal to increase the number of affordable households by next year by almost 1,000 units, and to develop a long-term funding for services. So how are we going to get there? In 2019, the city worked with the Ann Arbor Housing Commission to do an analysis of city-owned sites to see which ones were financially feasible for affordable housing. What does that mean? It means that it is in a location that is buildable and that you can secure competitively for different kinds of funding. We looked at 13 different locations. Most of them were in the downtown. That just happened to be what the city owned and managed. And here's just a map representing those locations. And what do we look at? So you have to look at planning and zoning. Like literally, what can you build here? And was there any other plans for those sites? Were there any deed restrictions on any of the sites? Yes, there were. And so some of them we were not able to develop because they had other restrictions on them. We looked at environmental conditions. Having a contaminated site does not automatically preclude you from developing affordable housing because you can clean it up to residential standards, depending on what's going on. But some other environmental conditions can be noise, like near a railroad. That does impact federal funding that you can both tax credit and federal funding. Is it in floodway, floodplain, things like that. And then you just look at your financial modeling. What is your income target? Is it owner? Is it rental? What kind of resources can you use? So we went through every one of those sites, and then we figured out, which were the best to develop. After we did that, we did a variety of community engagement processes. We talked to our own residents and other low-income households to try to figure out, since these are mostly in the downtown, and we have a lot of families we were trying to help, would you live in the downtown? Would you live in a high-rise if you had minors? We're not New York City, so it's a little bit of a change for people who are used to suburban neighborhoods to live in a high-rise. And a lot of our families, that was not something they wanted to do. So we looked at all of our sites, and then in 2020, a community group that we worked with put the millage on the ballot, the affordable housing millage. And we actually had 73% of all of the folks in Ann Arbor voted in support of it. So if any of you voted in support of it, I thank you very much, because it has been a critical piece to combine with developing of these city-owned sites. Because all of those funding sources I showed you in that chart, they take years to pull together. And I cannot compete with the private sector to acquire a parcel or a building when it takes me 2 years to 3 years to pull all my funding together. The seller is not going to be interested. And so having public property available to take the time to actually do the development was critical. And then having the millage was also critical. So the millage is restricted to 60% AMI or less. It also cannot be used in a floodplain or a floodway. And up to 20% of the millage can be used for services for people who are living in the housing that was built with the millage or redeveloped or renovated. City Council adopted some guidelines as to what they wanted to see in the housing that is developed with the millage. I'll let you read it on your own. It's pretty flexible. One thing I will say is that I would never use millage funds as the only source of funding to develop affordable housing, because you can leverage city millage funds with all those other funding sources that I showed for our RAD developments in order to build more housing. If I only used millage funds for every unit I developed, I could maybe develop, I'm going to make this number up, 100 units compared to 1,000 units if I leveraged other funding sources. Even though it is really hard to do, it'll stretch our funding a lot farther. And we do actually collaborate with the sustainability department. They've helped provide funding to pay for the geothermal that we are providing at our Catherine Street project. And somebody asked a question about the SEU, and I know what it is, but I am not so knowledgeable about it that I can tell you how we are going to be able to partner with the SEU on future developments, but we are having those conversations to try to figure that out. I can tell you that. So what is our strategy? So what we're doing with the millage funds is we are looking at projects that we have in the pipeline, including city-owned properties that we're developing. And we are also trying to build a pot of money so that if something comes out of the marketplace, we can acquire it quickly. And then we have a request for proposal process for non-housing commission projects that are also doing affordable housing. So we do not have to be the developer to utilize the millage. We also provided funding to other developers, which I will show you what those projects are. So we've partnered for many projects with Avalon Housing, where they have a 3-phase project called Hickory Way on South Maple. They're about ready to start phase 3. They're trying to go through their site plan approval process. As you can see, between the 3 phases, their total development costs are going to be about 45 million. It's probably going to be a little bit more of that with inflation escalating so high every year. And about $1 million of that was from the millage. So they've leveraged other funds besides the millage to develop this housing, but they do permanent supportive housing. Most of the folks living there are homeless, and so they do need intensive services, and so they get an annual allocation of service funding to support the residents at Hickory Way. And that's 109 units there. They're under development. If you go down Platte Road, the Grove at Viridian, that was previously a county owned site where the old juvenile center used to be. And this site is being developed as a mixed income. It's split. Avalon is developing the on this map on the right hand side, you can kind of see in green and yellow, there's a border. They're doing 50 affordable apartments. And then on the left-hand side is a for-profit developer that's doing market rate development. So for this project, about just under 2 million out of the 20 million, so about 10% is coming from the millage, and then they will be getting service dollars as well annually. And this is a picture of what it will look like when it's finished being developed. They're actually planning on moving people in this summer. They have 30 project-based vouchers from the Ann Arbor Housing Commission, and then 20 of their apartments are not project-based vouchers, but they're way below market rents. So back in the beginning, when I asked you to think about what rent, or what housing cost level you think we need in the marketplace, their rents will be, I'm not going to remember the exact amount, I'm going to say somewhere between $700 and $900 a month. And when they opened up their wait list, they had 7,000 applications for 20 apartments. 20 apartments. That shows you what the demand is. And they ended up selecting about, I think it was like 100 or maybe 500 of those 7,000 by random lottery to become their wait list that they pull from. This is the largest new housing that is being built, affordable housing in the city right now. It's 250 apartments. It is a for-profit developer. They're the annex group. It's called the Union A Squared. It's behind the post office on Stadium Drive. It's under construction right now. It's a $78 million tax credit project. And because they are a for-profit development and not a nonprofit development, we are providing them with a loan as opposed to a grant. It's well below market interest on the loan, but then we can use the payments on that loan to invest in a future project. And the loan amount itself, they've agreed that their 30% AMI units are have a deed restriction on them, so that they'll be long-term. I think it's a 99-year deed restriction, if I recall. There'll be long-term affordable housing there. Typically, the tax credit program the IRS has a 15-year affordability period, and MSHDA, the state of Michigan, requires a minimum of 30 years, and most folks commit to 45 years to get more points. But for millage funds, one of the goals of City Council was permanent, long-term affordability. So anything the Housing Commission develops, we have a permanent deed restriction because we're a governmental entity. Avalon commits to a long-term, I think the law limits it to 99 years when it's not, us, for example, 99 years affordability, and so did the Union A Squared. All right, I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions or comments before I go into the projects that the Housing Commission is developing.
I have a question about building units in the private sector. So over the past 10 years and now, like more and more high rises are popping up. People say like, oh yeah, we just need to add more housing stock to the market because it's a supply and demand issue. Do you think this actually helps with affordability, or does it just keep driving the cost of housing up? Because then, I don't know, I see other mid-quality rentals just keep increasing their rents because, I don't know, the value of renting in Ann Arbor just keeps increasing with all these luxury units.
I do believe in the supply demand cause and effect. I 100% believe that the more housing that you have, no matter what the price point is, it will positively impact your marketplace. The hard thing to see in our community is we're adding more housing and we're adding more demand. And so it hasn't leveled out or tipped it the other way. I don't believe that high cost new housing causes other mid or not, older housing to have higher prices. It's the people who want to live there. It's the demand that is causing that. And you have to have more housing in the marketplace for those older or, what would have been mid-level or lower cost housing for their prices to drop. Because it's 100%, I believe, based on demand. So even though I'm an affordable housing developer, I support housing all across the board. I think it's good for our marketplace. Somebody else asked if supporting families with children is challenging, is there a partnership with AAPS or other school districts? All of our housing service providers that provide services to our families 100% are just tied in with the school system. So Peace Neighborhood Center, Community Action Network, and Avalon Housing are our three family service providers, and they're in constant communication with the public schools. 100% needed. Any other questions before I go into? Oh, yeah, go ahead, Bill.
Are there any first-time home buyer programs in Ann Arbor for someone who's trying to get into the housing market?
So there are primarily resources through the state of Michigan, so they can be used in any community, including Ann Arbor. It's hard in Ann Arbor for first-time home buyers because the price point is so high. But anybody can access, or I shouldn't say that, there's income limits for the state down payment assistance programs. The city of Ann Arbor, through its planning and zoning regulations, does have two, well, I'm pretty sure it's just two that are Stone School townhomes on Stone School Road, as well as just Ashley Muse, which is downtown on corner of Ashley and Main Street. Ashley Muse has 6 condos that are available for low-income households that have been in existence since that building was built. You don't have to be a first-time home buyer, but it tends to be because the price point is so low, and they're all 1 bedrooms. Stone School townhomes, they have 2, 3, and 4 bedrooms, if I recall. And it's below, they have a restriction on what you can sell it for. And so in both those cases, as a buyer, it's affordable, but you don't realize full market equity because you can't sell it at market rate. And so there's this natural tension, and you can't have it both ways. You can't have something that's restricted at an affordable price and make sure it's affordable for the next household, and make sure that the person selling it is maximizing the equity that the value they get it when they sell it, because you can't do both at the same time. So you do have to make a decision on which way that you go. On our home ownership program, everybody's a first-time home buyer, but I don't think you have to be, but that just naturally ends up being what happens. I can't think of any specifically for first-time home buyers other than those.
Well, the reason I asked is I lived in California before I moved here, and my wife and I were in a below market rate program where a new construction, a certain percentage had to be set aside for the below market rate program. You applied for it. You still had to get your mortgage and all that. At that time, the mortgage was 18 and a quarter. But,
Wow.
you know, and then you had to sell it to someone else that was in that program. But if you stayed in there for 20 years, then you could go to market rate. So those units, which sold to us for 50,000, are now going for $1 million
Yeah,
in
yeah.
Sunnyvale, California.
Yeah, in California, the state, and things keep changing there, you know more about it than I do, but they have inclusionary zoning, is what you're talking about, where a certain percent across the board, rental or owner, have to have some affordable housing. That is actually not enabled in the state of Michigan's planning and
Okay.
zoning regulations.
Okay.
But the city of Ann Arbor has negotiated that, as well as when a developer wants something like increased density or changes in setbacks, it enables the city to require them to have affordable housing, or they can pay cash in lieu of affordable housing, and it goes into the city's affordable housing fund. And so there used to be additional owner properties that had affordable units that were similar to what you described, and they're beyond their restriction, and so they're now market rate. They don't exist anymore. Anybody else before I go into the next section? It was mentioned that park property conversion requires ballot approval. Would it be possible to purchase school district property? Could they split a parcel, allow housing built to accommodate teachers, counselors, families, and children? Yes. If the school wanted to do that, yep, they sure could. I've seen, I can't tell you where, but as I monitor affordable housing stuff, I've seen that happens in other communities. They absolutely could do it. This is great info. Oh, you're welcome. Okay. I've actually had conversations in the past with some school board members who were thinking about doing that. And it may still happen. We'll see. All right, I'm going to end this presentation talking about projects that we are developing. So after we went through that 2019 financial feasibility study and the millage was adopted, we did all this community engagement, and we looked at site by site what people thought about those sites. This is just a chart of like who participated. But what we were really trying to figure out is what most people would find acceptable from a height and density perspective for these various sites. Because at the end of the day, even though we're a public entity, we do end up going through and have to get site plan approval. Back in 2020, that required city council to approve every project. Now it's most projects, maybe even all, go through the planning commission. It doesn't have to go to city council. And so it became it's always very political. And so you want to make sure, at least I feel like we want to make sure that we are demonstrating that we have enough community support so that we can make it comfortable for elected and appointed officials to support our projects as well. So the first project I'm going to talk about is 350 South Fifth. This has been a boondoggle of a site. I've been involved in it since 2000, what year? It was about over 20 years. I actually worked for the city when the city first acquired that, when the Y moved to West Washington and the building got condemned. And I was part of the group that had to relocate all the people living in the single room occupancy units that were there into a hotel for like 2 years. It was delightful. So I am determined that we will get this site developed before I retire, because I have been involved in it for over 20 years. We are working in partnership with the AAATA, the Downtown Development Authority in the city. So it's public partnership, which can take a long time to figure out. What we're trying to do is both add affordable housing and add capacity, or at least minimize the negative impact of our site on the capacity of the transit at the Blake. So our current proposal, and we're about to go through site plan approval in the next couple months, is a 19-story, 1 and 2 bedroom, all 300 plus apartments, all affordable. So in the low-income housing tax credit program, the income limit is 60% of median income, or you can do what's called income averaging. And so that was a recent change that allows you to have some units at 80% AMI, so that you can also have units at 30 or 40 or 50% AMI. So it was an incentive to have more lower income targeting by adding a few units at a higher income targeting. So that is our current plan. And the first floor right now will be a commercial space. The challenge is, how do you incorporate all of that on on the ground floor, and how do you incorporate all of that with the increase in buses? So what we're doing is we're working with the AAATA to create a transitional loading zone for passengers that goes from their site to our site, expanding that loading area and adding bus bays so that people have a safer way to get on and off when they have transfers, so they don't have to always go over to 4th Avenue, but there will still be buses on 4th Avenue. But there's a lot of challenges in figuring out, like garbage dump trucks and noise and electrical metering and sidewalks. Like, there's lots of things to figure out the details to. And so we're pretty close to having a site plan that we're ready to submit to the Planning Commission. Catherine is under construction right now. When we went to the community, and I should actually say, when we went to the community and asked questions about 350 South Fifth, we asked similar questions to what I'm showing here for Catherine. And 350 South Fifth was the site that had by far the biggest support in the community for a very dense, tall building, which is what we're building there. Catherine was had a lot of support for low-income housing, and it had less support for a high, anything more than like 5-6 story building. And that is what we're building. And it doesn't exceed the height of the buildings that are surrounding it. It's more of like a D2 zoning, not a D1, where you're transitioning into a residential neighborhood. We are doing 63 apartments, and half of them are supportive housing for people who are homeless at the time that they become our tenants. And then the other half, like I said, were people in the arts. Um, how do you determine that? You have to be low income, and we are working with a group called I just blanked on their name. They only do low income housing for artists, and they are our art space is what they're called. So they are consulting with us on how to do that. And basically, we will have to open a wait list, let folks know what the restrictions are, and they'll have an interview process to make sure that people who are in the creative fields, or you don't have to be making a full-time living off it, and it doesn't have to be literally somebody doing painting or sculpting. You could be doing a film. You could be doing spoken word. You could be doing digital art. There's all kinds of ways you can be an artist. And that is specifically allowed in the low income housing tax credit IRS regulations, oddly enough. We are building this on what was previously a parking lot, a public parking lot. So our commitment was to reserve as much parking as we could while still developing our site. So we'll end up with 16 public parking spaces and 2 shared electric vehicles for our residents only to use, so they don't have to have their own vehicle. And this is a really sustainable building with, I mentioned earlier, geothermal, solar, green roof, energy efficient, etc. This took 13 different funding sources to develop this site. Also had funding from the Downtown Development Authority, which has been a big partner of ours for all of our downtown projects. One of the goals of this site was to honor the history of the Black community, the West Side, as part of our development process. So we have on the first floor, we have community space for the residents. That would be on the right side of the screen, the yellow, orange, and green. We have on-site services. We're actually co-developing it with Avalon Housing, and they will be our service provider. But the purple space, the lavender space, is a separate part of the building with its own entrance and exit. And it will be a public community space that we're working with a group called the Community Leadership Council, made up of all Black residents, former and current residents of the neighborhood, as well as young Black artists. And so they're actually designing the space, and they are really emphasizing being able to communicate the history of the neighborhood, the West Side neighborhood, the successes of the neighborhood, the innovators, the first Black police officer, the first Black mayor. And so we're going to have a lot of history on the site, and we're going to have a lot of art and culture happening there. And it's going to be a public space open to the community. And this is our current idea of what the space will look like. It'll have a flexible space for events, for activities, for education. And so this will be opening up probably about 6 to 8 months after we're opening up the residential space. The residential space will be completed in February of next year, and this should be opening by the late summer, fall of next year. Another site we'll be doing next is what's 404 North Ashley. It is the gray blob, the solid gray blob. This is where the U of M dental clinic used to be. It's going to be a building probably a similar size to Catherine, and also our Community Leadership Council is calling the building Dunbar Tower, after the Dunbar Community Center that used to be the center of Black social life back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so it's when you hear me talk about Dunbar Tower, that's our Catherine site. This site on North Ashley is also in what used to be the Black neighborhood. And so we will be working with the Community Leadership Council as well on figuring out what should be built here. Should it be senior housing, family housing, housing for single adults? That will be part of their discussion as well as the rest of the community. The other site that's in the west side neighborhood is on, well, on the map on the right, it's a very large lot. It's the city. If you're going down Main Street on the left, you'll see all those dilapidated buildings that are coming down. It's an old public works site owned by the city. We cannot develop in this black striped little area because that's floodplain, but there's a small parcel that is high and dry that we've split off and we've named it 123 West Summit. And we'll have somewhere between 5 and 12 apartments. I'm guessing it will end up being for families as well. And then the other sites we're developing that were city owned, 1510 East Stadium. It's currently fire station number 2. It's on the corner, almost at the corner of Packard and Stadium over by the Dairy Queen. And so we've looked at different ideas, you know, tearing down the building and doing duplexes for families that look like single family homes, or doing like a 4-story building. It's a pretty small site with not a lot of, there's no on-street parking, so we have to accommodate all the parking, which limits the size of that building. Another site is 353 South Main. I think this will be farther down the road because of all that's happening right now on these blocks. So we do have that site as one of the ones we're going to develop as affordable housing, but I can't tell you when that'll happen. The Ann Arbor Housing Commission owns a property that runs between Platt and Springbrook. It is in a residential neighborhood. So we've had conversations, for example, with Habitat for Humanity as a potential partner to do some modest single family homes in that neighborhood. So those are the properties that are in the pipeline right now that are city-owned sites or previously city-owned sites that are now owned by the Ann Arbor Housing Commission that we are developing. I expect us, well, I don't think we're going to hit 1,000 in 2026, but we'll hit 1,000 by 2027, maybe 2028, but I'm pretty sure we'll hit it in 2027. Not necessarily all developed by the Housing Commission, but by other developers as well. I'm going to pause right there and see if anybody has any questions or comments about development. I forgot I had one little small thing after this. All right, the very last thing I wanted to talk about is in our voucher program in 2022, we were designated as a moving to work community focusing on landlord incentives. So that is a challenge in the voucher program with the high cost of rent. There's also a high cost of barrier to entry, particularly for people who are homeless, in getting a security deposit, application fees, etc. Finding landlords that will work with us, that will not put up barriers to tenant evaluation applications and things like that so that people can get into housing. And so it offers a lot of flexibility with our funding that we used to not be able to do. And so what we've been doing is working with landlords and tenants to pay for things that usually are barriers to getting into housing. So these are some examples of things that we've been doing with our voucher program. Probably the biggest one that we do is security deposit assistance. And then on the landlord side, we provide incentives for new landlords and deal with some of the fears that landlords have, like people moving out with a lot of damages. So we help pay for damages. And there's other programs in the community. Somebody had asked about who we work with. There's a lot of different nonprofits that work together in the housing and homeless area. And there's a thing called Barrier Busters at the county. And the idea is we're trying to bust barriers quickly for somebody who's in a crisis, whatever that crisis may be. A lot of times it has to do with housing. And so various funds go into that, including the city provides, if you make a donation when you pay your utilities, your water and sewer utilities to the city, you can make a donation into this fund. The fund goes to Barrier Busters and it can help somebody else pay for utilities, backload utilities, for example. All right, that is the end of my presentation. If anybody is willing to share something that you learned today that you did not previously know.
I have something to share that's also a question. You showed us that chart of Washtenaw County housing units and that there are more vacant units than there are affordable units. So my first question is like, why are they uninhabitable? Are they just really expensive? And my second question is, how could we reduce those vacancies and get more people into those housing units?
Those are really good questions that I should have explained. It's mostly naturally occurring vacant units. So if a homeowner moves and puts their house up, for sale, it's vacant. At the time, at that point in time that it was, whenever that study happened, or if you move out of an apartment and it's vacant because they're turning it for the next tenant. There's not that many that would be uninhabitable and need to be fixed up, although that does happen in the community. It's very rare that that would be the case. Anybody else like to share anything? Or if you have any unanswered questions? All right, well, I thank you all very much for taking a large part of your Tuesday evening to hang out with me tonight. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Enjoyed.